In this chapter, we are going to do some very darkroom traditional kind of stuff using Photoshop, so we're going to be non-traditional in a traditional way. While I'm talking, why don't you open up dodgeandburntest.psd. It is in your working folder if you want to follow along, and I hope you do. Now, the tools we're going to be working with are right down here, these three: your basic dodge, burn, and sponge. Now, in a very generic way, dodging lightens, burning darkens, and sponging will either increase or decrease the saturation and or the vibrance of the colors that you're interacting with. Now, by interacting, I mean all three of these tools are controlled by you and a paintbrush. So there is a certain technique here. A little bit of practice, getting it the right way, using these tools. These tools are controlled by a brush, so you can control the brush up here, make it bigger, make it smaller, make it softer or harder on the edge, or you can click here and get a plethora of ways to use the tools. Let's just go plain old boring round brush, about 45 pixels with a hardness of 100%, and that will change based on what you're doing. I'll click here again to close that area. Now, all tools have options. Interesting thing about these tools, though, if you look at them, the dodge tool looks like a lollipop to me. The burn tool looks like a hand with the index finger and the thumb kind of making a circle, and the sponge tool looks like a sponge. Traditionally speaking, we used to take pieces of cardboard and put them on the end of a coat hanger and put it in between the light source and the paper that we were enlarging and making our photograph with to lighten areas up by removing light. Burning, we'd use our hand a lot of times and make a circle so the light would go through, and we'd use the back of our hand to kind of cover some of the areas to lighten it up. This was totally an art form, and it took experience because you didn't know what it looked like until you dropped it into the developer, the stop path, and the fixer, and you took a look at it. We get instant gratification here. We get to see as it works and stop when we like it. Let's start with the dodge tool. So we'll select this one right here. Now up here we do have some options. For example, you have a range, and you've got midtones, shadows, and highlights. Now, like any other image, midtones, in most cases, is where most everything is, like a big old bell curve where it falls off on shadows and highlights. So we'll start with midtones. Exposure is how much it will reduce the image in terms of lightening before it stops. So as long as you have your hand on the mouse and you're dragging and you don't let go, it won't do any more than 50%. It's up to you to change that number. Now, there are two options right here and this one way over here that are used to control your drawing tablet. And since I have one, I'm going to turn those on, which I usually leave on right here. Now, let's come down into the grayscale area with midtones. So if I get right about here, right in the middle, I'm going to hold the Shift key down too, so I draw in a straight line. And if I go back and forth, you'll notice it's primarily working in the middle areas. Now, as long as I have an exposure set at 50%, it won't go any more than 50%, no matter how much I rub back and forth. But you can see it has primarily gotten these areas in here and stopped here and here. Let's go into shadows. Get in the same spot right about here. I'm going to hold the Shift key down. Notice it concentrates more on the left, or where the darker areas are. And if I come up here and do highlights, and we'll put that on top right about here, it's going to concentrate on the highlights. Now think of that as working in an image, which we will do. As you work on the image, the areas of the image that are darker, lighter, or in the midtones will be influenced the most. Now we also have burning. That does the exact opposite. Let's just do two of those. Let's go into, say, shadows. And I'll come to about here. I'll overlap this one by 50%. That was the dodge, and this is the burn. And again, you can see it's doing the exact opposite. It's darkening the areas. Let's do highlights too while we're here. And I'll do it on this one up here. See, it's darkening it up, the opposite of what we just did. If you've got a good hand and a feel for your brush, you can do some very precision-like work. Now let's look at the last one, sponge tool. Now notice it changes from exposure to flow. Now flow is constant. In other words, the more I rub over an area, the more it's going to apply a desaturate or a saturate of the color, and that's how fast it's going to do it. We'll leave that at 50%. That's the default. Let's start with desaturate. You also have another option here called vibrance. Let me turn on my options here for my tablet. The vibrance option is the vibrancy of the color related more to the middle tones. Let's leave that off for now. If I come with desaturate and get right about here, and I'll hold the shift key down again, and just begin going back and forth, eventually those areas that I rub will go to grayscale if I keep doing this. I'm removing the saturation of the colors. Now they look light, they look dark, but they are in shades of gray. If I change that to saturate and say come up here, it will increase the saturation of the colors. Now what is that exactly? What's saturation? Saturation is the purity of the color. A perfect red, a perfect blue, etc. Vibrance, let's go back to desaturate. And let's go underneath here and click and drag back and forth. Now you will notice it's removing some of the purity of that color, but leaving a lot of the middles. And so you still do have some color, but less of it. And the same thing is true if we go to saturate and leave vibrance on. Let's go up here. It's increasing those middle areas of color and giving it more vibrance. These three tools have been used in traditional darkrooms for probably over 100 years. They have been in Photoshop since the beginning. There are other ways to achieve what we're going to do traditionally in this chapter, but sometimes the best way to work is just one-on-one with a brush, and that's why we're here.